Drag on your appearances, find a view angle, and hit render. That's all there is to getting good renderings, right? In many ways, SOLIDWORKS Visualize does make it just that easy. But I don't want good renderings, I want great renderings. We're going to take a look at a very important aspect of rendering, and that is light. It's often overlooked, but unless we understand it, well, we're all just in the dark. So today we'll take a look at why lighting is important, we'll take a look at some examples, what we can control, and we'll take all of that information and see how we can apply that in Visualize to our renderings. Now before we get too far, let's talk about the importance of good lighting. Why bother work with our lighting at all? Well, good lighting can add contrast, it'll add realism, emotion, it'll draw attention, but for the most part, what most people are looking for when tweaking lighting, at least to begin with, is that they're accurately portraying the materials and colors that they have available. A lot of times renderings are used for marketing purposes and you're looking to represent this part as accurately as possible, and lighting will often make or break that for you. Let's take a look at an example here. Now I created the image on the right using SOLIDWORKS and Visualize, and I created the lighting using HDR Light Studio, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. I found this image on the left hand side here as I was browsing around on Pinterest, and no, I'm not going to stop so you can laugh at me for using Pinterest. I actually use Pinterest quite a bit for looking for rendering ideas and lighting setups and things like that. But at any rate, in this case, I found this image. I thought it was kind of cool looking, so I decided to try to recreate that, and I just made a quick model. Now it's not exact, it's maybe 80% of the way there, but I just spent a few minutes just kind of moving things around and tweaking it, and I came up with something that was kind of close. Now when we're looking at this, if I contrast this to a different lighting scheme that I could have used in Visualize, we'll see a dramatically different result. So if I switch to an example here where on the left is the same image that we were looking at from Visualize, I've taken the exact same Visualize project and I've just applied a different lighting scheme to it on the image that you see on the right. So the exact same project, the only thing that I've changed is the lighting scheme and what I've used in terms of the environment. So I had one of the default ones with kind of the lowest contrast one that I could find, so I sort of over exaggerated, but certainly could be one that you would use, and my tweaked lighting that you can see from HDR Light Studio on the left hand side. Now this could easily be the scenario where you bring a model in and you get something like the image you see on the right and you think, you know, man, I thought this software was good, it just doesn't look realistic. Well, it is, but the lighting is just so far different from what you have in your head or what you're trying to compare it to that it's not accurately representing what you have applied in terms of materials. So again, you can kind of see how those things would come into play and hopefully see why lighting is a very important aspect of getting realistic renderings. Now let's take a look at an example here. I found this example on shutterbugs.com, and you can head over to their website and check out this article because it is a great article. But what I liked was in their images, they have sort of a side-by-side where you can see the lighting setup that they used in a diagram on the right and the impact that that has on the lighting on the left. Now I'll recreate this in just a second, but it's kind of nice to see this with the diagrams. So we can see here we have just the fill light turned on. This is the light that will be slightly dimmer than our main key light, and that will be just filling in detail from one side, so we don't have totally complete contrast from one side being bright and the other side being unlit at all. So we'll see that when we combine the two of these, the key light being the main light source, the fill light filling that area in to illuminate detail on the opposite side, we can see that you can kind of balance the two of these together. Now these lights happen to be at a 4:1 ratio where the key light is 4 times brighter than the fill light, and you see in this particular case they actually blocked off part of the key light to try to focus that light down to exactly where they wanted it to go. Now after that, they've added a light to the background, and you can see they've added what they call a gel there. That's just a transparent piece of plastic that you slip over the light, and that will illuminate the background. Now we have an easier time of working with this in rendering in that we can switch out what Visualize calls backplates. So we can sort of independently control the background from the product, so we can just worry about our product lighting and replace the background with whatever we see fit, and we'll look at that once we get into the software. One more note while we're here, if you're looking for some interesting videos to check out on the web, this one in particular, Carl Taylor's high-end product shoot, this is an awesome video. I've watched through this a couple times, and I think I've actually even used the image that he ends up with as an example in one of my previous Visualize webinars, but jot this one down or I can send you the link to it. This is a good one to watch. All right, let's head over to my makeshift studio and we'll take a look at this kind of in real time. Let's take a look at an example lighting setup that's similar to the one that we just looked at. A lot of times I find that people will take lighting for granted because we don't really think about where the light comes from. We just walk into a room, we flip on the switch, or we walk outside and the sun is up. So we have light and we don't really think about where the light is coming from, where the shadows are going, what needs to be lit well, and things like that. Also, our eyes do a very good job of adjusting for light, which cameras are not so good at doing. So let's take a look at this setup and we can see what we can adjust to try to make the light go where we want it to go. I find that it's helpful to try to boil this down into 3 kind of overarching controls rather than trying to think about a whole bunch of different things at once or just sort of guess and check as we go along. Now, I don't want to intimidate you guys with my high-tech setup, so I'll show you what I'm working with here. I took my shirt off, so I have some kind of a background, and I draped it over a chair, put my product onto a desk here, and I've got 2 simple desk lamps, one over in the corner. I've added some, I don't know if we can see that, I've added some cardboard towards the bottom there. We've got Mr. Coffee hanging out that's sort of blocking some of the harsher light from hitting the desk, over in this region. We still have a reflection there, but on this side I added the pop filter from my microphone because it turns out the desk lamps that I purchased were not dimmable, so I needed some way to adjust that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And of course my camera in the middle. So through the camera we're looking at just the product itself, so you can kind of see down the barrel there, we're shooting directly at the lens itself. Now we have both of these lights kind of off at a 45-degree angle, and they're shining in the direction of the product. All right, so the 3 things that we can really adjust here are the location of the lights, the brightness of the lights, and how diffuse or direct the light is going to be. Now on the front of these lights, I don't have any diffusers or anything like that, except that the bulbs that are in the socket have some diffusion built into them. So if you were to shine an LED, LED light is very direct. These happen to be LED bulbs, but the shroud around them is designed to diffuse that light. So any light bulb that you buy in stores has some kind of powder in there or coating or something that will diffuse the light rather than it being so direct, just so it's a little bit more pleasing for the eye and will more evenly cover the range that the bulb will hit. Now let's take a look at location here first. Obviously this was the one that probably makes the most sense to us because we can move the lights around, and you'll see as I'm moving the light around that changes where the hotspots land on the product. So as I'm shifting my light around, you can see that that is affecting, of course, where the shadow goes on the background, which is something that we have to consider in photography, but it also will adjust the hotspot of where the light actually is. So you can see it kind of moving back and forth across the product. Right, so we'll leave that somewhere around here, again kind of back around the 45-degree angle. Now moving the light back and forth kind of radially in this case we'll basically just adjust its intensity. Alright, so I can kind of adjust its intensity, but you see the reflection also widens as it gets closer. We can adjust that in rendering as well. I'll leave this just sort of at a natural distance away. Now on the opposite side, I have what would be that fill light. So in the example that we looked at with the microphone there, we had a key light that was coming in from the right-hand side, which is what I have here with my main light, this guy over here. And on the opposite side, I have my fill light. So they used a ratio of 1:4 in their lighting, so that the key light is 4 times brighter than the fill light. Again, I just used my pop filter that kind of laid over the top to cut some of that light down. I don't know what the ratio actually is because I can't control their dimming, but we can kind of turn these on and off, and you can see the difference in intensity in adjusting the brightness. So if I turn off my key light or my main light, you can see I have now just the fill light, and I can sort of isolate what that light is particularly doing for the lighting, the overall lighting on the product. Now if I turn off the fill light and we turn on the key light, you can see without the fill light, it sort of falls off into darkness too quickly on this side of the product. So on this side, unless I have some kind of reflector over here to bring light back onto it, it sort of falls off. Now you can do that with sort of dramatic lighting. A lot of times you'll see portraits and things like that done that way, where they're intentionally just really brightly lighting one side and not lighting the opposite side at all. When it comes to product photography, and this applies to rendering of course as well, most of the time you're trying to highlight the product itself rather than trying to build some kind of emotion. So you're trying to evenly light it, but still have a little bit of contrast to make it interesting. And that's kind of where that 4:1 ratio comes from. So brighter on one side than it is the other. That will add a little bit of interest to the image and still have things lit well enough and evenly enough that you can sort of see what's going on. Now, the last thing to consider is, again, how diffuse or direct your light is. Most of the time you want it fairly diffused unless you're looking for really crisp hotspots in the model. Now, I mentioned that this one in particular is not particularly diffused other than the bulb itself, so I don't really have anything blocking the light. Now, diffusion can happen in a couple of ways. Either the light can scatter when it hits the surface, so if you have like a satin finish, you'll see the light scatter more than you will with a smooth finish. Or you can scatter the light before it hits the object as well using some kind of light diffuser. So you can actually see this fairly well on this particular model here, where on this shiny part in the top, you see the reflection is much more defined than it is on this area up here. Now, obviously this is coming from the same lighting source, so when it hits the model, the lighting is scattering more here than it is scattering here on the shiny part of that model, and you'll see that exact same behavior in rendering as well. So light can scatter both ways, either on the surface or before it gets to the surface. And if I use something to diffuse the light a little bit more before it hits the object, you'll see that that will fan that out and soften the light a little bit more. So if I put something over my light source, it does cut my the amount of light, the brightness down a little bit, but you can see that difference there in the more reflective part of the model here. So this shinier section down here, you'll see that kind of soften up a little bit. Now, I don't have a great diffuser here. I'm using, again, high-tech equipment, so I've got a coffee filter that I'm sticking in front of my light, but you sort of get the idea, right? You can scatter light with something, a larger source that will diffuse the light before it gets to the subject, and then if your surface finish is something that will scatter light, that will also happen as well. Now, we've talked about how the light lands on the subject itself. A photographer's challenge is to try to get something in the background that will look pleasing. So the third option that they used in that setup was to shine a light from, behind the model out into the background. And that would be something you need an additional light for. So obviously you're adding cost and complexity to your lighting setup. In rendering, we've got a pretty nice advantage to this because we've got the product. We can swap out the background with whatever we want. In Visualize, it's called a backplate, and we can use that backplate and light that sort of independently. We can create our own thing where the backplate is not affected by the light, so we have much more control over that than a photographer would, in that they have to capture the background and the product at the same time. We can isolate the two of those. So we've got an easier job there. We really only have to worry about lighting the product properly or how we want it to be lit, and then we can worry about the background sort of as an afterthought. So let's head back to my desk and we can see how to apply all this into Visualize. So guard your eyes, it is about to get bright. Oh, that's bright. It's like that scene in Lord of the Rings when they first come out of the mines of Moria and it's blinding white rocks. Okay, so there are really 4 types of things that we can do when we're controlling the lighting when it comes to rendering in Visualize. The first thing that you can do, probably the most common, and that is to just use the standard HDR environments or the preloaded environments that come with pretty much any rendering package, right? It'll come with some options. You can also find these on the web, download them, and pull them in. So that's your first option. Use a default and hope that it works for your purposes. Now, the second 2 options are variants of each other, and that is to bring in one of the default ones or the preloaded environments and then start tweaking those for your specific purpose. There's 2 ways that you can do that. You can use a light, so add in a light in Visualize, or you can create something physical that will give off light and move that around. We'll look at both of those options. The last option and the best option, certainly the easiest option, is to use HDR Light Studio. And HDR Light Studio will allow you to manipulate the HDR environment itself, the high dynamic range environment. Now, when you're rendering and also in SOLIDWORKS, the environment will wrap spherically around your part. So it's sort of a globe around your part that will have hot spots and dark spots, and that will affect the lighting that is reflecting off of the model. So you can spin that around and manipulate that. So we'll take a look at that here. Now the first option here, I have kind of pet names for these, is the whip, flip, and strip. Now that's the most common option, I think, and that is where you'll take in one of the defaults, drag it in, whip it in, spin it around to try to find, get the lights in the right spot, and then if it doesn't work for you, strip it back out and go look for something else. Again, the next two are variants of that. So whip, flip, and finesse. You can pull something in, spin it around. If that doesn't quite work, then add in some light here or there. And of course, HDR Light Studio is the last option. Now, keep in mind that the first three, all of these three can be done in Visualize itself, where HDR Light Studio is an add-in product. Now we'll take a look here with this lens model that I have found on the web. And again, another case where I found an image online and I liked how the image looked. So I found a model of it and I tried to mimic that using, in this case, again, HDR Light Studio. So this one's probably a little closer than the last one. We'll use this particular model as we go through working with the different options, and you can see how those will play out. All right, so we've got the Visualize project open here, and again, we have whatever scene is preloaded. Now, in this case, I have a custom scene that is the one that I was using to create that image that you saw on the other one. We're just in sort of preview mode here, so it doesn't look like it's being rendered, but once I snap into fast, you'll see this come up a little bit nicer. Now, again, in the first option, we're just sort of ratcheting things out, and we would do that by going right over to the appearance, and under environments, we can start looking through some of the environments that are available. And again, we try one of these, we drag this into our working area and see if that does it for us. Now, again, with those adjustments from the scenes tab here, we can rotate the entire environment around. And what that will do is, you can see it will move those lights kind of around, centrally around that part. Okay, now if this comes up with something that will work for you, perfect. This is probably your easiest and quickest approach because these are already set up, so you can drag it in, see what you can get out of it, and continue. Now, if that doesn't work for you, let's say we have this somewhere where we like the lighting over here, but it's too dark for us on the opposite side, then we can go in and we can try to augment these, or whip, flip, and finesse these into something else. And we can do that one of two ways. We can add in a light through the Environments tab, or we can add in some physical pane that will act as a light. So let's take a look at the first option here first. If we right click from within the environments tab here, you can also see there's some options over here in the scene settings if nothing is selected. One of the options is to add a new light. And from adding in a new light, we can make a selection on this light and have its controls pop up from within the pane. So now we're adding something outside of the HDR light environment that's surrounding the component. Now we're adding in an additional light. And many softwares have options like this. In SOLIDWORKS, it's a very similar process. And we can move this light around to try to get this lit in a way that will work for us. Now, what I'll usually do is I'll just zero these out. So I'll just set my position to 0, 0, 0. That way I can kind of bring the light right to me, and then I can move it around from there. So I can come up and select my manipulation tools, and from here I can start moving things around. So I can grab the light. Now we have 3 different types of lights that we can work with. And as soon as I move this light off to the side here, you can see it will start to add that hotspot right into the model. Okay, now in this case I have a point light, so the direction doesn't really matter. It's just sending light out radially in all directions. But we also have a directional light, which you can choose what the direction will be with this other selector, and a spotlight, which we can choose its direction and the cone angle of the light itself. In this case, I'll just leave it as a point light just so we can see how to manipulate these. Now you can see we get a triad once we select the light and have our manipulation tool turned on. So we can move and rotate. In this case, rotate wouldn't do us too much good with the point light, but we can move this light around until it's shining where we want it to go, depending on what type of light we're using. Now you can see from within this camera angle, this is a little bit difficult because I maybe want to move this off to the side, up and to the side, but I can't really get at it. So rather than moving around the view, that your final view that you want it to be here, what I would prefer to do is come to the cameras tab and just add in a new camera. All right, so if we right click from within here or deselect the cameras, we can add in a new camera, and that will allow us to sort of manipulate this off in some other angle and still save the angle that we have. Now let's go ahead and we'll continue manipulating this. I'll move back to my scenes and I'll select my light again. From here, let's scroll ourselves out a little bit and we'll start moving this light around. All right, we can see we can push this up and over. But at this point, I can't really see where this is going to land on my final image. So I have two views side by side. If you have Visualize Pro, then you could do two panes side by side. You could keep an eye on one image as it's working with the main view. And outside this view, we can work with this off to the other side. But either way here, I'll just leave this as a single pane. We can kind of move this around until we get where we think we'd like this to be. And of course, we can adjust its properties as well. So we can adjust the color by a selector or by Kelvin. So if you're used to working with Kelvin, that works out nicely. Lower Kelvin values will be warmer lights, where higher ones will be whiter or towards the blue spectrum. So you can see that kind of warming up as I drop this down to 2400 here. You can see the outskirts of that are starting to warm up rather than being pure white. We can adjust its brightness. So if this is too bright for me, I can turn this down. Somewhere we'll crank this down to 85. You can see that's a little bit softer there. Now, wherever we want this to go, we can kind of get this in place, sort of guess and check style, and then we can come back to our original view and set this in. Say, okay, maybe this is what we want, maybe this isn't, and we can go back and tweak and back and forth. So there's a little bit of an iterative loop there where we're adjusting the light, coming back to it. Again, if you've got Pro, you can do it side by side, so that helps a little bit, but it's still kind of a clumsy process in getting that in place. It certainly works, but it's not the most elegant way to do it. Now, the next way that we can do this is with a physical component that is putting off light as well. And the process is basically the same. So if we move back to our scenes here, I'll take the light that we just created and I'll remove this because we don't need this for the next setup. Now from here, we can add in something physical. Now from within Visualize, this isn't really a modeling tool, so we would have had to have something in the model that we could bring in, but there are a couple of things that we can add in from within Visualize. So if we go over to our Models tab here, from within here, we can add in a few little things. So under Create, under the right click here, we have a handful of primitives that we can create here, which are perfect for creating little lights. We've got a plane that you can make kind of a box light with. You've got cylinders, cubes. You could use a torus, a ring light, or something like that. We'll just use a standard plane in this case. Now I'll set this plane down and you'll see that it lands right at the bottom of my part here, which works fine. Now all on its own, this doesn't really do anything for us. So let's go to the Appearance tab and we'll add an emissive appearance to this. So back to my Libraries tab, and from within the libraries, instead of environments, we'll take a look at our appearances. And from our appearances, we have a folder for emissives. All right, so from the emissives folder here, we can add in a light of one of these default varieties or make our own. And in this case, we'll just add a warm light to this. So I'll apply that appearance to that panel, and you can see that immediately brightens up at least. Now let's move this around to a place where we want this to be positioned. So to do that, I'll come back and I'll use that same camera angle that I used for the other one, just so we don't mess up our original camera angle. So I'll switch back to my camera 1 here, my sort of default camera. That's my free cam. And we'll make a selection to the pane itself. Again, kind of same process. I still have my manipulation tools turned on. So from here, we can start moving this thing around. So let's push it up a little bit. We'll bring it off to the side and we'll rotate this a little bit. Get this kind of about there. That looks okay. Now you'll notice that nothing is happening in my rendering. I don't see any reflection. I don't see any emission coming from this, and that's because I'm in fast render mode. So if you want to see the interaction between emissives and the model itself, we can switch ourselves over right here into accurate mode. And now once we're in accurate mode, you'll see my lens start to light up from the effects of my appearances. All right, so let's go and start making some modifications to this appearance. But before we get too far right out of the manipulation tools, what I like to do is to take my pivot location and actually put my pivot location in the middle of my part itself. That way I can spin the light around the part and I don't have to worry about this kind of, the Cartesian coordinates that we have to sort of work with. So let's zero this out. I'll set that to 0 and to 0. And you'll see what that does is that moves my pivot location into the middle of the part. Now let's go take a look at the appearance tab here, and we'll mess with this appearance. So let's slide all the way down to the bottom and select the warm light appearance that I have on here, and that will pick up this pane. Now we can adjust this in similar fashion to how we worked with that light itself. You'll see there's a brightness in here. We can adjust its color. The color is set in this case by the warm color that I applied to it, the warm light. But let's bump this brightness up here a little bit so we can see something start to happen. All right, so as I crank this up, you can see somewhere right along in here, see that hotspot starting to take place? All right, so we see that my box light is now kind of shining down, if you will, onto my part here, and we can now manipulate this light into a place where we want this to be. Now you notice that it does render a little bit slower using accurate mode. It's got more to do, but that's the price that you'll have to pay to use this technique. All right, so let's go back to our original view and see what we can see from the front here. Back to the default cam, and here we can see some brightness shining in from that new light. Now let's go move this around and see what we can find here. I'll select my plane there, and from here I can drag this around. Now you can see that's sort of, I'm trying to move slow. See that shift off to the left-hand side there. Okay, and what that's doing, let's back out here. So I've got this kind of where I want. Maybe I'll change the brightness of it or something like that. That works fine. Let's back out and see what this is actually doing. So I'm going to go back to my camera one here, my free cam, and let's pull ourselves back into preview mode just to speed things up here a little bit. As we're rotating this around, and again, I've set my pivot in the middle for this. As we're moving this component around, what this is doing is it's spinning this pane sort of around the axis of the in this case, our lens, and that's allowing us to sort of move that light around the particular product rather than having to shift in multiple directions. Okay, so this particular component here, we can rotate about its center, and we'll find that this will just sort of, see that, loop around from the middle. So I can very easily get this into a spot where it's just sort of pointing down from wherever we want this to be. We can copy multiples of these in here if we want to do that. Benefit of this is we can very easily animate these kinds of things. So if we have moving lights in our animations, again, if you're using Visualize Professional or something like that, you can shift things around pretty quickly with this technique. Other than that, the manipulation of it is fairly similar to working with a light that you've added in through Visualize. All right, now let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to HDR Light Studio. So let's remove this plane out of here. I'll hit delete. And we'll move ourselves back to our original camera angle, and I'll snap back into fast mode. Now with HDR Light Studio, what this allows us to do, and again, it's an add-in product that works side by side with SOLIDWORKS Visualize. What this allows us to do is to modify or create HDR environments from scratch. So the way that this works is if we move over to our Scenes tab here, you can see again, I've sort of got this default high contrast studio. Let's remove that out of there as well. And let's create a new environment. So if I deselect these, or if I right click, we'll see that we have an option in here for new HDR Light Studio. So right within Visualize, I can select this. And what this does is this will open up the software that I have loaded on my laptop, and again, work side by side with Visualize in order to help me modify my lighting arrangement. So as soon as I have launched myself into HDR Light Studio, you'll see that this gives me sort of a default gradient that I can work off of. Now, this is a little difficult to see with one screen side by side. Usually, I'll have my HDR Light Studio off on my laptop, and then I'll have my Visualize on my main monitor. With being this is a video, I really only have one monitor to work with. So I'll try to do this side by side and get you guys as much as we can here. So let me move this off to the side, and we'll manipulate this around a little bit. I can probably save some space here, and I'll maximize this over kind of behind. Okay, That will probably work something like that. Now, what HDR Light Studio allows us to do is either through use of preset lights or through adding in lights manually, we can control what the lighting is doing within Visualize. Now, this happens in real time, which is the coolest part of this. So I can add lights to my HDR Light Studio environment, and it will start re-rendering that as I'm in Visualize in real time. So let's go in here and we'll start adding in some lights. Let's say we'll use, let's use one of these lights here. So we've got kind of a soft light around the outside, so it's a little bit diffused already, and it's sort of a narrow profile. So I'll drag that onto my environment here. And what we'll see is that as soon as I do that, it will start re-rendering. Now, we don't see too much happening here because I'm not really sure where this light is. And that's really the struggle of working with lights in any way, is that where is this light in 3D space? As we're working with those other two methods, you saw that it was very difficult to get those in place and have that set so that it is in the right spot without leaving the view that you're concerned with or anything like that. Now, HDR Light Studio gives us the benefit of doing that because we can manipulate this directly within the HDR environment, or we can manipulate that within Visualize. So let's take a look at this. I want this to be straight up and down, so let's rotate this by, we'll say, somewhere around 90 degrees or so. We'll get this kind of sitting straight up and down. Now, I don't really care where this light is within the 3D or the spherical map around this. All I want to know is where is it going to be in the model. So what HDR Light Studio allows me to do is say, I want it here. And as soon as I do that, it moves it within the HDR environment to where that would have to be in order to make that happen. It's the coolest thing. So all I have to do is say, here's where I want the light. This is what I want the light to look like. Here's how bright I want it to be. And you're all set. So maybe this is a little small. Let's rescale this up a little bit. So we'll make this a little bit bigger. That looks kind of nice. I'll make it a little bit brighter. And we'll bump this up a hair. See that as we're rendering, right where I want it to be. All right, now maybe I want a light. Same thing on the other side. Maybe let's make this one a little bit bigger. Let's grab one of these. We'll pull this in here. And this particular light I want to be over here. So this will be my kind of fill light, if you will. We'll toss that in on that side and again start manipulating this one. So let's make it a little bit bigger. We can make it a little taller, increase the length of it. We'll brighten it up a little bit. All right, and now we can very easily manipulate this in terms of where we want this to be. So maybe I clicked a little far to the left. Maybe I want this a little further over here. We'll nudge it over, maybe somewhere. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And we can very quickly and interactively say, here's where I want the light, put the light here, and HDR Light Studio will do it. We don't have to worry about flipping our views around and trying to get this in a place where we can see where the light is going to be and then go back to our main view. Everything is taken care of by HDR Light Studio. Now, again, we can adjust any of these lights' particular properties. If we go into the light properties, you can see the nitty-gritties of them are in there. So you do have good control over these, but the ease of it and the simplicity of it is really what sells it for me. Now let's take this gradient down a little bit. For example, we'll bring the brightness down or maybe bump the opacity. We'll give ourselves a little bit more contrast between these lights and the background. So as I'm darkening this down, you see the effects of these lights a little bit more. One of the coolest things I think with HDR Light Studio is when we were in my little studio, my makeshift studio there, as I was switching off those lights, you could kind of see what one light was doing versus the other. So I had the fill light kind of flipped on, and you can see it was sort of definitely more dim than the key light was. You could see exactly what that light was doing for you in the lighting environment as a whole. And HDR Light Studio has that capability as well, and I think it's one of the neatest options. So if I wanted to see what any of these lights were doing on their own to the overall lighting scenario, I can say solo this light. Now this is really nice once you get multiple lights. This is obviously a very simple scenario here, but if I solo this light, again, what this does is it will re-render it in my Visualize window. And from here, I can see, okay, this is all of the light that this single light is contributing to the overall lighting scheme. So maybe I have a little bit more control over here and say, yeah, this is how I want this to fall off on the side. Or maybe I want to add another light to highlight that edge over on that side. Or we can really get a good handle on what that particular light is doing for me and see how those overlap. Now, as soon as I unsolo that, you'll see that it will go back to standard and we get that lighting scenario just back to the way that it was. All right, so I have definitely not found an easier way to do this, and I think every seat of SOLIDWORKS Visualize should come with HDR Light Studio. So if you're in the market for Visualize, definitely look into this product and let us know as well. Now, once we're set with this, we've got this kind of cleaned up. We can say, all right, we're all set with this. You can save out of here as well, which is nice. So you can save out a high-res environment that you can use. You can also store that with your project, which I like to do, just save out the lighting environment. That way, if anything gets lost, I can just reapply that. Or you could even use this lighting scheme in another different project that you're working on. So from here, let's go back and we'll maximize this again. All right, so at this point, we've got our lighting as easy as can be. Here's where I want the light to go. The light is there. Now, again, you can work with this in the same way as any other environment. So if I wanted to rotate this around or what have you, I could still do that. Now, as I've been moving things around, we've seen that in the background, I have those lights coming, swinging behind. And I talked about when we were in my little studio that we have an easier time of controlling what's in the background than an actual photographer would. And the reason for this is we can add in a backplate that's unaffected by any of the lighting. So for example, if I liked the way this lighting scheme looked, but I don't particularly care for that gradient in the background, maybe I wanted to black that out entirely. We could do that. So all I've got to do is take an image that represents the size of the image that I want to use and what I need in the background and apply that. So for example, if I wanted this to be black, I can drag and drop that in, black out the entire background, and now it's completely just silhouetted in there. With the microphone, they use kind of a gel effect on the background to shade that in as blue. I could do that as well. I made, just a quick background in Photoshop that sort of mimicked what they did there. And from here, I can add in that as a backdrop as well. Again, completely unaffected by the lighting, so I can isolate those two and get exactly what I want. So from here, maybe I can make another camera angle that's specific for this one. I'll say, new camera, or even better, let's go back here a step. If I liked this camera angle, I just wanted to be zoomed out a little bit. Let's do a copy and we'll do a paste here. And now we can take a similar view and we'll just modify this a little bit. So I'll just zoom out there a little, maybe kind of pull it down, something like that. So my vote is the easiest way you could possibly control your lighting. HDR Light Studio is the way to go, no doubt, no question. You can get exactly what you want by just simple selections and create very complicated or simple lighting scenarios that give you exactly what you want. All right, so in summary here, you're adjusting the location, the brightness, and how diffuse or direct the light is going to be when you're moving things around and adjusting your lighting. I would say in order of convenience or how common it is, I would say probably the first option for using the built-in or the preloaded HDRs is probably the most common. So the whip, flip, and strip, that would be probably the most common, and that's usually my starting point. Honestly, I'll start with there, see if I can find one that will work for my purposes, and if I can, perfect. If not, then I'll move directly to HDR Light Studio. So that's my second step. If I can't get what I want quickly, I'll just jump directly into HDR Light Studio and make my adjustments there. Now again, if you don't have HDR Light Studio, let us know. But if you want to use one of those other options, then the two of those would be I'm not sure where I would draw the line on those. I think that would be personal preference as far as what would be the easiest one to use, and it would probably depend on the scenario, whether you want to add in a light or add in a physical panel. If you can get a light to do what you want it to do, that's probably the easiest one over making an extra panel and then adding it in. But one of the two of those would come afterwards. So usually start off with the default one, see if I can get what I want, and then jump into HDR Light Studio. So thanks for watching today. Hope you guys learned something at least, and got to see a little bit of how HDR Light Studio works in conjunction with SOLIDWORKS Visualize. And we'll see you next time. Don't forget to check us out on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and our blog for more great content by clicking on the links in the description below.